If you're starting to feel the holiday stress, I have got the answer for you. So our Rest and Relax oil by Radical Roots is hands down our bestseller, and it is so for good reason. This formula is so safe, effective, and versatile. Everybody loves it. So what we did is we combined full spectrum, high quality hemp with a Chinese herbal formula that nourishes the heart and calms the spirit. So it's great to take during the day if you're feeling any sort of anxiety or stress, but it's also awesome to take at night if you're looking to make sure that you're getting the highest quality sleep that you can. I take it almost every day, and I'm certainly taking it any time that I'm recording a podcast. Head to radicalrootsherbs.com, use the code HOLIDAY30 and get 30% off of our Rest and Relax tincture through New Year's. Hey guys, it's Dr. Chloe, and this is the Radical Remedy Podcast. Today is the second episode of our 3-part mini-series about glyphosate and other environmental toxins that we're putting on our food and putting in our bodies and thus impacting our health. Our guest today is truly, truly one of my greatest heroes, and it was such an incredible honor to speak with Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She is a senior research scientist at MIT, and she's known for her somewhat controversial theories about glyphosate and its potential impact on our health. So join us as we delve into the world of glyphosate research, discuss its controversies, and explore its broader implications for public health and agriculture. And remember that we are building up to something big in our final episode. We're going to have Caroline Allen from Beam Minerals, and she'll be here to shed light on the importance of minerals in our diets. So stay tuned for that conversation as well. Dr. Stephanie Seneff, it is a tremendous honor to have you here. I've been following your work for years now. Thank you so much for joining me.
Delighted to be here. Thank you for having me.
So we have a lot to talk about. I've been nerding out on your book, Toxic Legacy, all week, and I really hope that everybody goes out and buys it because there's no way we are going to be able to go into all of the detail in this show. But I'm really, really excited to dive in. So let's get started. Why don't you give us an explanation of sort of what is glyphosate and how did it become so pervasive in our environment?
Sure. Glyphosate is the active ingredient in the herbicide Roundup. I think most people know what Roundup is because it's very familiar from your hardware store, your garden store. You go down and pick up a jar of Roundup and use it to kill the dandelions or the weeds in your walkway. Very convenient. Kills all plants except those that have been engineered to resist it. And perfectly harmless to humans. And that's what we're told, perfectly harmless to humans. So people aren't worried about, exposing their kids to it, exposing their pets to it, exposing themselves to it. They don't think it's a problem. And the government has really, really misled us on that because my research has shown that it is extremely toxic. And it's toxic in an insidious cumulative way that gradually erodes your health over time. So that's a problem with it because if you look over a short time, you can get by with not noticing that it's toxic because it's a slow kill. I think that's a crucial part of it. And you don't feel an immediate response, so you're not aware that it's poisoning you. Kind of like arsenic, how you get arsenic poisoning over time and eventually it takes you down. It's a slow kill. So that makes it very, very dangerous. And the government thinks it's perfectly safe, or at least they say they do. They're, of course, bought by the industry. They don't bother to test whether glyphosate's in the food supply, but in fact, others have tested and they have found high levels of glyphosate in crucial foods that are very common with the kids. Things like goldfish crackers and Oreo cookies and Cheerios, and oat cereals, oatmeal. The oats have very high levels. The garbanzo beans or chickpeas, which is like the legumes, they're called, lentils, garbanzo beans, chickpeas, hummus, for example. Sky high levels have been found in those foods. Canada actually tested over 8,000 different foods, both sourced in Canada and from Europe and from Mexico, because of pressure from a friend of mine, Tony Mitra. He's a great guy. He's Indian born, but he's Canadian citizen. He pressured their government for years before finally they gave in and gave him all the data. And he created a book called Poison Foods of North America, a very dry book with lots of data about all these different foods. And it's very disturbing to me because, it's just that it is all over the food supply. Honey, for example, you really can't buy honey in America that's not contaminated with glyphosate. You can't keep the bees away from the glyphosate-contaminated flowers, right? So very difficult to avoid it. But certainly the certified organic label is a good thing. And Canada showed that the certified organic foods in general had sometimes zero, but also much less. So they were contaminated at times, but it was much less than what they were seeing in the non-organic foods. And they also found that foods from North America, that's why he calls it poison foods of North America, the United States and Canada had significantly higher levels on average in the food samples that were taken by the Canadian government compared to Europe, for sure, and also compared to Mexico. Mexico came out more or less in alignment with Europe with much less glyphosate. So that's an important point. If you can't find certified organic for the thing you want to buy it from Mexico, which is quite interesting. The Mexican product is likely to be healthier.
That is wild.
So, yeah, so government says it's safe, and they say that because the industry supposedly showed that it was safe in studies that they did way back when. So glyphosate it's been around for a long time. It was first introduced on the market in mid-1970s, like 1974 in the United States. And so the industry claimed they made some rules about how to evaluate whether a chemical was toxic or not. And they did some really no things. Like, for example, they mix it up with other things in formulations. Like Roundup contains other stuff in there that's also toxic. And in fact, Seralini is a researcher in France who really became aware and made a big noise out of the fact that the other ingredients in Roundup are very acutely toxic, even much more so than glyphosate. And they can cause damage all by themselves, even if the glyphosate's not there. And they allow the glyphosate to get into the cells. So they basically help the glyphosate to be more toxic than it would otherwise be. And they are intrinsically toxic themselves, the other ingredients, which were never evaluated for toxicity. And glyphosate was evaluated on rats, rat experiments that the industry did way back when, probably 1960s, where they exposed the rats to glyphosate in isolation, which is very different from glyphosate in context of the formulations. They never looked at glyphosate in the context of the formulations. And they also looked for only a few months. They had a rule that if you didn't see toxicity at the end of 3 months, you were good to go. You didn't have to look any longer than 3 months to see toxicity in animal studies. And when Seralini did a long-term study, which was really a very big breakthrough, I think, in the awareness of its toxicity. This was in 2012, I believe, and he published a paper together with colleagues. And they had done the same, basically reproduced the study that the industry had done. This sort of same number of rats, and had the control group. And then they had various combinations that they exposed the rats to. So they had several different groups, one of which was just the GMO crop without the glyphosate. And one was just the glyphosate without the GMO crop, and then the combination of the two and that sort of thing. All of the treated groups came out bad compared to the control group, which didn't get any of it. But they looked fine after 3 months. You couldn't really see any obvious difference after 3 months. By 4 months, they started to show symptoms. And by the end of their lifespan, the females had massive mammary tumors. The males had significant damage to their kidneys and their livers. Both genders had reproductive issues. And so it was really pretty much, and they died early. They died prematurely. So, and this was a small dose. So that's why it took time for the, appearance of trouble. But, they demonstrated that the same dose that the, industry had used to prove that it was safe, proved that it was not safe for these rats. And that was a real breakthrough, because I think then after, the other thing that they said is if you don't see damage at high doses, then you don't need to look at lower doses. And I think they also said that because they were aware that when you look at low doses, they turn out to be more toxic than high doses. It's quite interesting. That's a characteristic feature of endocrine disruptors. And now it's been pretty much proven that glyphosate is an endocrine disruptor, which means that a very low dose is actually more toxic than a higher dose. And that's probably because at a low dose, it starts to simulate actual endocrine signal. So it basically emulates an estrogen, for example. So it's called an endocrine disruptor when it pretends to be some kind of hormone that then disrupts your whole hormonal system, because you're getting this strange hormone showing up that isn't supposed to be there. And there's a lot of chemicals that are endocrine disruptors, but glyphosate is now pretty conclusively shown. And there's a recent review paper came out in the last few years that, did a good deep dive into all the papers that had shown that glyphosate was an endocrine disruptor, and they found issues with the thyroid hormones, the reproductive, estrogen and testosterone, and lots of different issues showed up in, of course, causing things like obesity and reproductive issues and thyroid disorder and all these kinds of things. So, and also teratogenic, causing damaged fetuses that were, had severe genetic mutations being caused by the glyphosate as well. So, so basically it is much more toxic than we think it is. And our government doesn't want us to know that. It's basically what it comes down to.
Yeah, well, it is truly alarming when you go into all the different details and the different pathways, which with glyphosate is affecting. And you do such a beautiful job laying that out in your book. I'm so interested. I'm an acupuncturist and a doctor of Chinese medicine. So one of the things that as a practitioner, our field is really known for is working with fertility and helping people get pregnant, which is one of the greatest joys of my profession, to be honest. And it is pretty alarming to see the levels of infertility. I think in your book, you mentioned that it's 1 out of 7 couples are currently infertile. And I think 2 to 3% of babies born in the States these years are born through IVF, which I think that there's a whole lot of information that's sort of lacking in terms of the research on how that's going to impact the children who are growing up. So it's all very, very interesting. One thing I want to go back to is sort of the introduction of Roundup. So I know it came out in like the 70s, but at that point it was sort of a pervasive, it would kill everything that it was touching pretty much. So farmers had to be very selective with how they were using it. But then as I understand it in the 90s was when they brought out the Roundup Ready crops, these GMO crops that everybody claimed was going to save the world and eliminate world hunger. But allowed it so that the farmers can just spray glyphosate all over the crops and only the weeds would pass away because all of the Roundup Ready crops would be able to thrive with the glyphosate. Could you explain a little bit why farmers would spray their crops with glyphosate right before they're harvesting the crops? Because that's pretty alarming to me.
That's really alarming. And I didn't realize that at first. I had actually done quite a bit of studying of glyphosate before I realized that they were using it as a desiccant. And it was really because of the wheat problem that I picked up on that, because I was thinking, gee, celiac disease, there's all this stuff about gluten intolerance, all these sections showing up in the grocery store with all these gluten-free foods. What is this? What's going on here? I was like, that seems weird. And I knew wheat wasn't I knew wheat wasn't a GMO crop. I knew it wasn't a GMO crop, so I couldn't figure out why it would be a problem. And then I realized that I found out that it was being sprayed right before harvest. I think that's pretty routine in a lot of places and probably pretty heavily done in the United States and Canada. And that's done to kill the crop. So it's actually intentionally wanting to kill it. As it dies, in its last gasp, it goes to seed. So it helps to synchronize the production of seed, because you can have some parts of your field that are not quite ready when the other ones are ready. And so if you harvest everything at once, you're going to miss out on an opportunity to get the seed from those crops that are premature, that aren't quite ready yet. So you'd have to kind of, harvest different parts at different times. It would get complicated. So by virtue of, it's my understanding that by spraying the crop with the glyphosate, it kills it and it allows it to go to seed, which increases the yield. So you know exactly when to grab the seed. And then by virtue of killing the crop quickly, it makes it easier to clear the residue to prepare for next year's crop. That's what I've been told. Of course, it's also a head start on killing weeds for next year's crop as well. So you're kind of, it feels like a convenient thing to do. And if you assume glyphosate is harmless to humans, you don't think about whether that might be a problem.
Yeah. It seems amazing to assume that would be harmless to humans, but
I know, certainly. I've always been very suspicious of any poisons. I've been very careful with insecticides as well, but I never used glyphosate on my yard, even long before I was aware of the specific dangers of glyphosate. Just I don't use poisons. I'm always very careful about that. I don't spray insects in my house with I have never done that. So I just common sense tells me just stay away from poisons, especially when you've got young children. So
Yeah, well, and I feel very fortunate personally as an herbalist. There's always an herbal alternative for some sort of homeopathic or herbal spray or essential oil that you can do to do a similar job that's less toxic. But yeah, it is fascinating to think that it doesn't affect the body. However, what it is affecting is, many of the microbes that are in our gut and in our body. And I believe that you said that about, what was it? About 54% of the species found in the gut carry a glyphosate susceptible version of this one synthase that you've been focusing on. Could you explain a little bit about the shikimate pathway and the EPSP synthase?
Thank you. Yes, very interesting. And that's where they focus. Of course, researchers would want to understand why is it the glyphosate. It was sort of accidental that they discovered that it kills plants. I think it was just an accidental discovery. And then, of course, they didn't know why, so they needed to figure that out. And so researchers discovered that it severely suppresses an enzyme called EPSP synthase. And that enzyme is pretty much universally present in plants, which is why it affects all plants. And that enzyme is a part of a pathway called the shikimate pathway. It's a biological pathway. So the pathway involves several different enzymes, of which that's a central one. And the pathway produces products, and those products are among those products are the aromatic amino acids. There are three of the amino acids that are the building blocks of all proteins in all of life. And the aromatic amino acids are among the subgroup that are called essential for humans because our cells can't make them. So our cells are unable to make those amino acids. There's tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. And so we depend upon either our food or our gut microbes to supply those critical amino acids to the host, to us. And so and many of the microbes also I think most of them have that enzyme, EPSP synthase, but some of them have a version of it that's not susceptible to glyphosate. And that's actually very, very interesting because that gives you a hint as to how glyphosate disrupts it. And I talk about that a lot in my book. You probably remember the chapter where I showed that it was pretty amazing and they know this, the industry knows this very well. You can actually take the version of EPSP synthase from some animal, just take any version of it, from some plant or microbe, that has a glycine at the place where it binds phosphate of PEP. So phosphoenolpyruvate is a substrate. The enzyme binds the phosphate of PEP at a particular site that has an amino acid sequence there that's characteristic. And that amino acid sequence includes a particular glycine residue. Glycine is one of the amino acids. If that glycine is swapped out for alanine, which is a minimal change, it's just added one extra methyl group. They're identical except for one extra methyl group in alanine. The enzyme becomes completely insensitive to glyphosate. And this is characteristic, I think, of any version of that enzyme, that you take out that glycine, replace it with alanine, and now it's completely insensitive to glyphosate. That is an absolutely huge hint as to how glyphosate is disrupting that enzyme, in my opinion. And although what they say is that glyphosate pretends to be PEP, so it gets in as a substrate and blocks the PEP by being stuck in the active site, the phosphoenolpyruvate. So it basically substitutes for PEP and blocks it. That's what they say. But I think they're wrong. I think the way that it disrupts that enzyme is by actually substituting for glycine in the protein itself. It gets assembled into the protein by mistake because the assembly process thinks it's glycine. And that makes sense because it is a glycine molecule. It's a complete glycine. That's why it's called gly, right? It's a complete glycine molecule, except that it has an extra thing attached to its nitrogen atom, a methylphosphonate unit attached to its nitrogen atom. And that methylphosphonate is a bulky thing that's going to get in the way of things. But because it's a place where it binds phosphate, that particular protein has to have room for the methylphosphonate unit, which is what replaces the phosphate of PEP and prevents PEP from binding. So once you've got glyphosate stuck into the amino acid chain, it's got its methylphosphonate sticking out into the hole. And now PEP can't get close and the enzyme can't work. And I think that's what's going on, that it's disrupting the enzyme's ability to bind to PEP because it's replacing glycine in the enzyme and then disrupting its ability to do its job.
It's wild. I remember reading your research on your hypothesis that glyphosate was replacing glycine years ago, and just it blew my mind. Then it still does now.
Yeah, it's a fascinating thing to try out. And I remember actually Anthony Samsa was the one. I had been toying with the idea and I dismissed it because I thought because it had extra stuff on its nitrogen that it wouldn't work. But then Anthony Samsa was collaborating with me, and he's a really good chemist. And he said, no, Stephanie, you should take a look. I think maybe that's what's happening, And so once I did take a look, I was just like, oh my God, this must be it, because it made so much sense in terms of when you look at the proteins that you can predict would be affected beyond APSP synthase. I think I know there are many other proteins because studies have been done on E. coli that show all kinds of proteins that get suppressed by glyphosate. And so the easiest way to explain how one chemical can be so corrosive, how it can cause so many problems, so many seemingly very different problems are caused by glyphosate in health. And that's what people say, how can one chemical cause so many things? That's how they sort of deny that this is possible. And this is how it could, because you find the particular proteins that have what I call a glyphosate susceptibility motif. And I talk about that in my book. Not just that there's a highly conserved glycine at a place that's essential for the protein, that if you change that glycine, that protein's in trouble. It critically depends on that glycine. And that glycine binds phosphate or possibly sulfate. It binds to negatively charged SO4 or PO4 anion. So those are very specific things. And then I can even give the additional constraint that if the left neighbor is a small amino acid like glycine or alanine, that'll help out too, because you need to have that room. So I've kind of characterized which proteins would be expected to be susceptible. And then when you look at all the diseases that are going up dramatically, what's causing those diseases, it's like a giant jigsaw puzzle. But it works remarkably well that you can identify the particular proteins that are likely to be susceptible. And then you can find some for which it's been shown, because there are other proteins besides EPSP synthase that the studies have shown that glyphosate suppresses them. And those other proteins also have this characteristic feature. So it's kind of doing a massive connect the dots activity to figure all that out. But once you do, you're just kind of like, oh my God, this makes so much sense. It is so terrifying.
Well, and that's one of the things that I find so interesting about studying medicine is, the Western paradigm of medicine is sort of, you look at this one pathway, you're looking at this one outcome, you look at this one vitamin, this one toxin, whatever, and you don't look at the greater picture of what's going on downstream from that. How does that actually work? And how does that have different implications throughout the body? I mean, with the shikimate pathway and with all that, it's not only affecting these essential amino acids, but it's also affecting the gut and how that's functioning, which is absolutely essential to all sorts of health. I can tell you clinically what I see is that health is determined 100% or nearly 100% by somebody's gut health. I see that all of the time. My son, Remy, who has a rare genetic disorder, I was telling you, Remy has epilepsy, and he will only have seizures normally with the full moon, often a parasite connection. But he will always have diarrhea if he's having seizures, and he will always have seizures if he's having diarrhea. So I am very particular about his gut, and it's very wild to see the direct correlation and connection between the gut-brain axis. And it always blows me away that I can go to the top neurologists all over the world, and they can tell me that they see all of the time that the gut and the brain are closely interconnected.
I know.
They don't know.
In fact, the gut can be called the second brain. I think there was a book about that, the second brain. It may be the first brain because it has actually very big neurological connectivity, as you said, with the brain, but also it actually has apparently a neurological system that resembles more, I've heard this, the one in the brain than the one in the rest of the body. Like the rest of the body is kind of secondary, just kind of boring stuff. But the gut has all this, communication with the brain. And of course, the fact that the gut microbes have so much more DNA, I think their DNA, their amount of unique DNA in the gut is like 100 times more than what is in our cells. Our cells are very impoverished in the amount of proteins they can produce compared to the amount of proteins, the different unique proteins that the gut microbiome collectively can produce is huge. It's so much more powerful than the measly little number that we can produce. They were really surprised when they figured out the human genome to find out how small it was. I know they were really shocked that there were so few genes and so few proteins that were being made by the human cells. And so we depend on them for all kinds of things. We don't realize that until we find out. Once our guts microbes get damaged, we start to see all these symptoms that we didn't see before. And we finally trace it back to the gut microbes. And then we realize that they're doing these things that we didn't know they were doing. And so it becomes more and more evident that they are really powerful. I sometimes like to think of us as sort of a host for our purpose in life is to be a host for the gut microbes. We're housing them and giving them a nice environment to live in. Of course, we're poisoning them, so that's not so nice anymore, but that's what humans are supposed to do, is to keep the gut microbes healthy. Kind of questionable who's helping whom, I think. They're so important to be healthy in order for the entire earth to be healthy. And of course, the same thing happens with the soil microbiome as well. There's a microbiome in the soil. And when that's disturbed, then the plants are not healthy. And that's what's happening with the glyphosate as well.
Yeah, the ecology of it all is truly terrifying. Who was it? Dr. Perlmutter compared your book to Silent Spring, which I would have to agree with. That was the first book that led me along this path when I was in college like 20 years ago, and haven't turned back yet. And this definitely stands on her shoulders in a beautiful way.
Yes, I read that book when I was 14 years old. I remember it left a deep impression on me, probably influenced where I am today, but for sure,
Yeah. Well, and it's so fascinating to see how the microbiome and the ecology of our bodies reflect the ecology of the earth. And if we're not taking care of either, the other one is doomed to fail as well. So hopefully we can wisen up a little bit, and we will definitely get to some of the ways in which we can help impact, our health and mitigate the risks to ourselves and to the environment a little bit later on. But I still want to nerd out a little bit further. So I also wanted to talk about, so you have a couple chapters on phosphorylation and sulfate. Both of these seem very fascinating in terms of, especially with phosphorylation. What do you see the role of glyphosate is in the phosphorylation process, and how that might affect ATP and mitochondrial dysfunction? Because I see that a lot clinically as well, especially in the world of special needs kids with low tone and whatnot.
Yeah, I think that mitochondrial damage is central to what glyphosate does to cells to break them. And of course, many, many diseases are associated with mitochondrial dysfunction. So mitochondria are these little organelles inside the cells that produce the energy for the cell in the form of ATP, as you mentioned. ATP is adenosine triphosphate. So that's got 3 phosphates attached to it. And whenever you see phosphate, you got to think of trouble, because glyphosate messes up proteins that bind to phosphate. So it would make sense that it would mess up proteins that bind to ATP. And in fact, the binding site to ATP has a unique signature motif. They talk about these motifs. It's quite fascinating to look at the code, the biological code of life, which is so interesting. I learned a lot about that as a consequence of digging into all this glyphosate, idea of glyphosate substituting for glycine. What would it mean? And when I start looking at the patterns, and I think it's a GXXGXXG motif. So 3 glycines with 2 wild cards between them. GXXGXXG, they call that. They use this pattern, X meaning anything. Any amino acid can go there, including glycine. So it could be G. It could all be G, and that would qualify as the motif. But of course, it often does have additional glycines besides those 3. But those 3 are crucial. At the binding site to ATP, all the enzymes, pretty much all the enzymes that bind ATP have that. And so any enzyme that binds ATP has my definition of a glyphosate susceptibility motif, meaning that glyphosate could easily slip in place of any of those 3 glycines. And if it does that, it's going to mess up that protein very badly. And so I have a whole chapter devoted to the chapter. I don't know if it's chapter 5 that describes my evidence to support the idea that glyphosate substitutes for glycine. And then chapter 6, I'm not sure if that's right, but that goes into the phosphate, a whole chapter devoted to phosphate and the proteins that bind phosphate and what that means in terms of how it's going to disrupt things for metabolism, but especially the mitochondria are central because they're making that ATP. So they're obviously binding phosphate. There's another one that's called NADPH, and that's Even NAD has phosphate. NAD is nicotinamide adenine diphosphate, 2 phosphates. And NADP has 3 phosphates. So those are also energy carrying molecules, sort of like ADP. And those and proteins that bind NAD are very likely to be disrupted by glyphosate as well. And there's lots of them because they're very much involved in metabolism, and they're very central to the mitochondria and the whole citric acid cycle. Those proteins are very important to make that work. So one of them is, for example, succinate dehydrogenase. Succinate dehydrogenase is an enzyme in the mitochondria, is central to the citric acid cycle and also central to the oxidative phosphorylation. That's what makes the ATP. It works in both of those pathways. It's the only enzyme known that works in both of those pathways. Deficiencies in succinate dehydrogenase. So people who have genetic mutations that make it broken, that's a high risk for various kinds of cancer. And the cancer is a consequence of the disrupted activities in the mitochondria. And succinate dehydrogenase has been shown experimentally to get suppressed by glyphosate. And it fits my glyphosate susceptibility motif. So it's just one example. There's other ones. PEPCK is another one. Phosphoenolpyruvate carboxykinase. I'm particularly interested in that one. And I talk quite a bit about it in my book because it exactly matches the pattern of EPSP synthase. So we know that glyphosate suppresses EPSP synthase. And PEPCK binds PEP, the same one that EPSP synthase binds, phosphoenolpyruvate. They both bind PEP, and they both bind PEP at a site where there's a highly conserved glycine. So it's basically the exact same model that you would expect PEPCK to be suppressed by glyphosate because of this resemblance to EPSP synthase. Now, no studies have shown, I could not find any studies that showed that glyphosate suppresses PEPCK. But I think it's just because nobody looked, because I think it would. And if it does, it would explain a lot of things. So it makes sense. It would explain, basically, it would prevent the liver from being able to convert fats and proteins to sugar under situations where the blood sugar is low. So what happens when you get into a crisis, if you're exercising a lot and not eating, your blood sugar drops too low. Normally the liver kicks in and says, oh my God, I got to make sugar. And it can do that efficiently using PEPCK. But if that protein's busted, it can't do that. And then you can get into a coma because your blood sugar gets too low. And that even might be a source of sudden infant death syndrome. I did a whole study on sudden infant death syndrome, connecting it to glyphosate in multiple ways. And that's one of the ways that it would cause it. Once you get too low blood sugar, you go into a coma and you can die. And particularly the infant is susceptible because it hasn't yet learned that PEPCK is in trouble. Once the body starts to adjust and say, oh my God, PEPCK isn't working, we need to raise the level of blood sugar systemically. So basically, I think what happens is the body adjusts. It says, oh my God, I've got to take into account PEPCK is not going to come right back with that sugar. So we better make the set point higher. There's a whole bunch of ability of the body to regulate things and take a look at this and that and the other and decide what to do. Really fascinating, the degree of control in those regulatory pathways. So what I think is happening is a blood sugar level is raised all the time in order to protect you from this dangerous situation where your blood sugar gets too low and the PEPCK is not working. And that leads to sort of this high blood sugar, which becomes a precursor to diabetes. So then eventually it develops into diabetes, but it starts with this PEPCK being broken, I think. And of course, glyphosate, diabetes is one of the many, many diseases whose prevalence is going up exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops.
Well, and diabetes is now considered, what is the term? Like the second Alzheimer's or something?
Is that right?
Like Alzheimer's too.
No, in fact, Alzheimer's is sort of a diabetes-like condition. Yes, exactly. I wrote about that actually.
Yeah, and I know that you talk a lot also about how glyphosate is impacting neurological conditions. Obviously, there's a dramatic increase in neurodevelopmental disorders. I mentioned to you before that my son Remy has a quote-unquote de novo genetic mutation, which for anybody listening, that means that it didn't come from me or Remy's dad, but it just happened in utero at some point. However, we've been exposed to numerous toxins. Both Ryan and I had been on chemotherapies at various points in our lives. And I have always suspected that there was something else at play. And, in autism also, clearly it seems that there is a multifactorial attack upon the developing fetuses, their the toxic load, the neuroimmune system, all of it. But it does seem, especially from your research, like glyphosate is playing an important role in terms of the attack upon the body. So why don't you tell me a little bit more about how you think that glyphosate is impacting some of these neurological and developmental disorders?
Right. In fact, it's an interesting story with autism. That's actually where I started. My history, for many years, I was developing computer software that would allow computers to engage in natural conversation with humans, precursors to Amazon Echo and the Siri platform. And along about 2007 timeframe, I was watching the autism rates go up every year. And I was worried. I mean, they would say, oh, we're just diagnosing it more. Don't worry about it. But I was worried. And I thought it must be something in the environment. They'd say it's a genetic disease, but why is it going up if it's genetic? Doesn't make sense. And so I started looking at autism in 2007. I did a lot of reading about autism, and I was looking at different chemicals to see different factors and looking for something that was going up and trying to figure that out. And I looked for 5 years before I came upon glyphosate. And during those 5 years, I had identified a problem with sulfation pathways. I was aware from work by a woman named Rosemary Waring. She was really quite progressive, I feel. She was very insightful, and she had been looking at autism back in the 1990s when it was relatively rare. She dealt with autistic patients, and she did metabolic analysis, and she found extraordinary abnormal sulfur metabolites in the urine of these autistic kids, way out of line, way too much sulfite. They were flushing sulfate and other sulfur, sulfur containing molecules. Their urine was really messed up as far as sulfur. And then at the same time, they had high sulfate in their urine, and especially high sulfite. And then they had thiosulfate as well. And then they had very low sulfate, free sulfate in their blood. It was abnormally low. So they were dumping sulfate even though it was deficient, which is really interesting. And I was so baffled by that. Why would they be doing that? It didn't quite compute to me. But I was aware then that sulfate was a problem with these autistic kids. And I'd written about it even before I knew about glyphosate. But once I started looking at glyphosate, I became quickly aware, given this glyphosate susceptibility motif problem, that the enzymes that handle sulfur in the body, many of them have that glyphosate susceptibility motif, critical pathways, segments of those enzymes that have glycines that are highly conserved at places that bind phosphate. And so in particular, sulfotransferase is very, very interesting enzyme, sulfotransferase. Those enzymes are crucial to so many important pathways in biology. And what they do is they take sulfate off of what's called the universal sulfate donor, which is a molecule called PAPS, PAPS, phosphoadenylyl phosphorosulfate, PAPS. Making that molecule is also hard in the presence of glyphosate because the enzymes that make it also have glyphosate susceptibility motifs. So you might have a deficiency in PAPS, but I think especially you have a deficiency in the enzyme that takes the sulfate off of PAPS and sticks it onto other molecules. Both of those are going to be problematic. In fact, PAPS it comes from ATP. It's basically a modified ATP molecule with an extra sulfate stuck onto it. Very, very interesting. And that's the universal sulfate donor. And the enzyme that makes that PAPS synthase, I think, is also going to be affected by glyphosate. So glyphosate basically interferes with the ability to attach sulfate to anything. And that becomes really, really problematic for many, many reasons. One of them is just detoxifying fat-soluble toxins because they need to be sulfated in order to become water-soluble. And then they can just be released from the liver into the blood, and they can go over to the kidneys and go out through the urine. So the liver has a big responsibility to turn fat-soluble toxic molecules into water-soluble toxic molecules so they can be gotten rid of. And sulfate is an important way that they do that it does that. And that's getting disrupted by glyphosate. And so things like there's a p-cresol that's a fat-soluble toxin produced by Clostridia microbes. And p-cresol has been linked to glyphosate, p-cresol levels in the blood. has been linked to autism. And precresol needs sulfation in order to be detoxified. Another example is Tylenol. And so Tylenol has actually been recently linked to autism. Not even recently, from way back, actually. People have been talking about the possibility that Tylenol being taken by the mom during pregnancy or Tylenol being given to the child is linked to increased risk to autism. So the pregnancy would cause a child to be increased risk of autism. And Tylenol depends upon sulfation also for detoxification. Also mercury, of course, mercury is another one that's been linked to autism. Sulfation is the important way to detoxify mercury. So all of these things become more toxic in the presence of glyphosate because of glyphosate's disruption of those sulfation pathways. And then critically, you have all the neurotransmitters. So you have the tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine that come out of the shikimate pathway. They're going to be reduced because glyphosate's messing up the gut microbes' ability to make them. And tryptophan is converted to a serotonin, which is a very important neurotransmitter in the brain. Serotonin is mostly made in the gut from tryptophan. So if tryptophan's deficient, then serotonin's deficient. And on top of that, serotonin is then sulfated. Sulfate is attached to serotonin and it's shipped to the brain as serotonin sulfate. And I think it's supplying sulfate to the brain. It's one of the suppliers of sulfate to the brain. So basically, there's all these different, it's both these polyphenols, they're called, and all the things that come from the tryptophan, the tyrosine, phenylalanine are sulfated. Those are sulfated, and then their derivatives are sulfated. And then they produce all these hormones that are sulfated and neurotransmitters that are sulfated. So thyroid hormone is sulfated, and serotonin, melatonin, they're all sulfated. And then there's also the cholesterol and vitamin D, which are almost the same thing, and they're also sulfated. So all these things and all the and hormones that come from them, testosterone and estrogen, they're also sulfated. So all these things are sulfated. And there's a reason for that people don't realize, I think, which is to transport sulfate and deliver it to all the tissues. Free sulfate is a problem in the blood because it will gel water. Sulfate is very good at turning water into jello. And that's a crucial role that it plays in the body. And every place that it's attached, it can build gelled water around it, which is actually makes what's called exclusion zone water. It excludes. And so the blood vessels line themselves with sulfate in order to build this jello, which also has a very slick surface, so the red blood cells can slide through the capillaries very easily. So the sulfate plays a critical role in making the gel, and the gel plays a critical role in keeping things out, making the vessel secure, and in allowing the red blood cells to flow freely. So it's going to mess up blood circulation if there's not enough sulfate, and it's going to cause things to get past the barrier because the sulfate builds this a gelled water layer that is a barrier. It's like a vascular barrier. So that barrier becomes compromised when there's not enough sulfate. And then critically in the brain, there's heparan sulfate. And that is in the cerebrospinal fluid. Heparan sulfate is super, super important for the development of the brain. The whole neurite outgrowth and the whole thing that happens in the maturation of the brain in utero depends upon this heparan sulfate. And continuing on into early life, the heparan sulfate is crucial for brain development. And heparan sulfate deficiency in the brain ventricles has been shown to be a problem in both humans and mice, in mouse models of autism. The autistic mice have low heparan sulfate. Autistic humans post-mortem have low heparan sulfate in the brain ventricles. And this gets to the pineal gland. And the pineal gland is a super important gland that makes melatonin in the evening to help you sleep. And every one of those melatonin molecules that it makes is attached to sulfate before it's shipped out into the cerebrospinal fluid. So again, sulfation deficiency in the pineal gland is going to cause an inability for the pineal gland to release melatonin and sulfate. And melatonin comes from serotonin, which comes from tryptophan, which comes from the shikimate pathway. So that's another problem. So you got all these problems coming at you. The melatonin and the sulfate are both compromised by glyphosate. Sleep disorder is going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on poor crops. It all makes sense, It all makes sense.
It's wild. And it's crazy to think, what is it? I think 54% of children have a chronic health disorder these days. The levels of neurodevelopmental disorders are skyrocketing, but also in adults, we're seeing these disorders, all of the autoimmune disorders. fatty liver disease going up. We've got all of these neurodegenerative disorders going rampant. And it's terrifying to look at the trajectory of health in our society. And there are so many rabbit holes I really want to go down with you. And I know that we have limited time, but I am going to ask you a question that's been a personal curiosity for me for quite a while. In your book, and you sort of mentioned it a little bit before, you talked about the maternal immune activation during pregnancy, and how maternal immune activation during pregnancy can increase the odds of the fetus developing or the child developing autistic-like traits. I know that there's been research showing that maternal immune activation during pregnancy can also increase the odds of the child developing schizophrenia and other neurological disorders. I was just curious what mechanism of action, if any, if you thought that that was working on, how that might be working. I remember when I was pregnant with my son, Remy, they started pushing the Tdap vaccine during pregnancy. And that was one of the sort of things that got me questioning some of the decisions. And, it was the first year that they had released it to the public, and they were recommending it for all pregnant women in their second trimester, I believe. And I kept going in and saying, cool, I'll consider it. Let me see the research. And they wouldn't give me the research. And so finally I looked it up, and I believe it was like a 30 or 40 person study that they had done like 2 years before, that showed that the fetus, the babies had slightly elevated titers towards whooping cough once they were born. And then they claimed that everybody was all clear. But I don't know that there are any long-term research studies on vaccination during pregnancy. I know this is treading in sort of interesting water, but I can't help myself but ask.
Well, I definitely think the vaccines are a significant factor in autism. In fact, I don't know whether they're collectively more than glyphosate, or whether glyphosate's the primary and then they're secondary. I can't say in my opinion, but I think those two, the vaccines and the glyphosate, are by far the biggest contributors to autism. And I really do believe that if we were to cut out the vaccination program altogether, we would see the autism rates drop. But I don't know how much glyphosate. If we could cut out both, if we could go to organic food and get rid of the vaccines, I think autism would almost disappear. That's what I would predict in time, and it'll take time because everything has to sort of work its way out. But I do believe the vaccines. I don't understand how. I personally don't understand how anybody can think it's a good idea to give a pregnant woman any vaccine at any time. I just don't understand that, because the vaccines are going to cause inflammation, and they're going to cause inflammation in the placenta and probably reach the fetus. DTaP contains aluminum, which is an extremely toxic metal. There's absolutely no reason, I think, why anyone should want to inject a pregnant woman with aluminum. I don't understand that at all. So personally speaking, I'm baffled as to why the government thinks it's such a good idea to do all these vaccines. We've got way too many. And of course, we have way more now than we did when I was a child. I only got smallpox and polio. Those are the only two vaccines I got as a child. And even my kids pretty much grew up by the 1986 ruling, when they said the vaccine industry is excused from any consequences. This was a critical law that was passed, and it needs to be retracted. This law that Reagan signed into law, 1986, that said that the industry was no longer liable for any injuries that a child might have. They set up this vaccine court, government run. If you think your child got an injury from a vaccine, you have to go through this special vaccine court. And if you think your child got autism from the vaccine, that court is going to make sure that you're denied any kind of compensation. They absolutely refuse to admit that the vaccines could be causing autism, which is very, very frustrating to me.
Well, I think it's honestly, since I live in the world of pediatric disability, I know many families who have children with who have been vaccine injured. And to me, the gaslighting and the silencing of these parents is going to cause, an untold amount of harm to future generations. And I think that, as a practitioner and as a mom, I understand that there's a tremendous amount of cognitive dissonance that goes around with this, because nobody's trying to hurt these children. especially parents, especially doctors. Everybody's doing what they think is best. But until we actually start listening to moms and start looking at the research and start being able to have open conversations about the research, about the pros and cons of every single medical intervention for every person, we're gonna continue down this disastrous path that we're on. So before we nerd out a little bit more on vaccines, I just wanted to touch base on what are some of the ways. I mean, again, I highly recommend anybody listening to this get the book Toxic Legacy. It's unbelievable. I have 15 pages of notes. Literally 15 pages of notes for today. I also have it on Audible. I needed the hard copy for my notes. But there's just so much information on there in terms of liver disease, neurological disorders, heart disease, autoimmune disorders. And I believe you mentioned in the beginning that there's obviously a tremendous connection to glyphosate and cancers, but you wanted to show how this is all happening since it really is such a slow burn and there are so many different pathways and mechanisms that are affected by glyphosate. So I really do encourage everybody to read this. It should be essential reading for every human as far as I'm concerned. But so since we've probably properly terrified a few people, let's talk about some of the ways that we might be able to mitigate our exposure to glyphosate and maybe help sort of detoxify some of the glyphosate from our bodies, if that's even possible at all.
Right. I mean, certainly, I think that it's really important to spend more money on food. I think people have to get used to the idea they need to spend more money on food because, unfortunately, our certified organic is more expensive. And, of course, farmers need to figure out how to grow organic food. We have a major, and more people are asking for certified organic. It's kind of flying off the shelves, which I find interesting. And we're also seeing more and more supply at even regular grocery stores. I've watched over time that it's becoming much more accessible than it used to be. I think more and more people are becoming aware and more people are demanding it. And we need to grow that group. I think we can solve this problem bottom up grassroots by getting individual moms aware of the need to feed their family healthy food. So I think number one really is to switch to certified organic food when you shop at the grocery store. That's the most important thing you can do for your children's health and for your own health. And then beyond that is eating only whole foods. So wholesome whole foods as opposed to, say, soy protein bars and candies. So you want to eat foods that are, you can recognize what it is. You see broccoli, you know what that is. You cook the broccoli. And also, of course, a lot of home cooking as well, because I think the processed foods definitely by themselves are nutritionally deficient. That's another issue because basically when the processed food industry is based on basically corn and soy and canola oil and soybean oil and soy protein and, flour coming from wheat. And then you've got sugar beets to give you the sugar. So you just mix together the sugar and the flour and you put in some flavoring, maybe some artificial flavors, that is an extremely deficient food. When you make a food out of those products that are heavily processed into these individual, very nutrient deficient things like flour and sugar and oil and vegetable oil, there's just not enough nutrition in that. And I think we have an absolute epidemic in B vitamin deficiency and probably vitamin C deficiency, vitamin D deficiency. I mean, all of the vitamins are deficient in our food and the minerals as well, because glyphosate is disrupting the uptake of the minerals. We didn't get into that, but glyphosate's a very big mineral chelator, and it grabs onto the minerals and prevents them from going up into the plants. That's one of the first things I learned about glyphosate when I first heard about it from Professor Don Huber. 2012, I happened to be at a conference where he gave a 2-hour presentation. That's when I first heard about glyphosate. And I walked away from that presentation convinced that I had found my answer to the autism epidemic. It was very good timing because I was struggling and looking and I couldn't figure out. And he gave me the answer, and I never looked back after that. I just kept on studying glyphosate from then on. And he showed experimentally that when you expose the plant to glyphosate when it's growing in the soil, it ends up with tremendous deficiencies in sulfur. Sulfur is one of the things it becomes deficient in, but also things like manganese and magnesium and copper and zinc, all these critical minerals that you only need in tiny amounts. But if you don't have them, then certain enzymes don't work at all. They critically catalyze several different enzymes that are crucial for metabolism. So we have an epidemic in mineral deficiency and vitamin deficiency, and also an epidemic in the deficiency in all these different phytonutrients that come out of plants. So eating a lot of fresh green vegetables, and especially a lot of herbs and spices. I really want to emphasize herbs and spices. And of course, sulfur-containing foods. And so I love the cruciferous vegetables. That's like broccoli and cauliflower and Brussels sprouts and cabbage. They're all very, very nutritious. And they have a really good source of sulfur to help with that sulfur supply, because we have a sulfur deficiency, as well as having an impaired ability to add sulfate to various molecules. So a high sulfur diet, a diet that's rich in foods that have a lot of micronutrients. And of course, organic eggs is a fantastic food. So that's both organic and rich in micronutrients, both vitamins and minerals. So you want to look for foods that are like that. And fish and seafood are another example. Very nutritious with lots of micronutrients. And then all these different fresh vegetables and fruits that have all these interesting polyphenols and flavonoids. These are really special molecules that are present in plants that get completely destroyed when you make the processed foods. They're gone. And so it's very important to eat whole foods. And I think it's important to devote time in the kitchen, to go back to the idea that you should spend time cooking for your family. You shouldn't just buy everything already pre-made. It's going to be healthier if you do that. And maybe try to make that a more valid activity, because we've been trained to think that we shouldn't waste time in the kitchen. We have better things to do. And I think we need to reverse that message.
I agree completely. I can tell anybody who's listening, I know that it can get tricky, but I am a solo mom of a child with multiple disabilities. I've gotten my doctorate in the past couple of years and run 3 businesses, and every single thing that Remy eats is homemade. It's totally doable.
Really super.
I'm not a superhuman. I love my food. And I think that it's the most important thing that I can and do for him is to make sure that he's fed whole foods and good quality foods, because he already has enough challenges that we're facing. So, and then I know that you often recommend apple cider vinegar.
Yes.
Based on a hypothesis.
And fermented foods in general, that I'm hoping that it's true that apple cider vinegar contains microbes that can metabolize glyphosate, can actually fully metabolize it to make it be a source of nutrition, which would be really cool if it's true. And I only say that. It turns out glyphosate has what's called a CP bond, carbon phosphorus bond, which is an unusual bond in biology. And most of the microbes, and certainly our own cells, don't know what to do with that. They can't break it apart. So that's why glyphosate ends up sticking around and doesn't get metabolized. But there are a few microbes that can break it down. And one of them is Acetobacter. Some strains of Acetobacter in a paper that I found can break down glyphosate. So it makes me hope that the Acetobacter that are present in the fermented foods can also break it down, which would be great. And that would be a good reason to have apple cider vinegar. But of course, it's also just fermented foods are good for you in general.
Absolutely. I always say that pretty much every traditional culture had a bone broth and a fermented food. So
right, bone broth is another one that you're definitely glad you mentioned that, because that's also important. Again, start with organic sources of the bones, and then just cook them slowly in the water, throw in all kinds of herbs and spices and vegetables, and you can make a delicious soup, actually. But the bone broth is important because it pulls all these minerals out of the bone and becomes very, very healthy with a nice balance of different minerals.
Yeah, I love bone broth. Wonderful. Well, I'm glad that we have some tangible steps for everybody to start taking. And, I think that it's also important for people to remember that you don't have to change everything at once, but it's like start making those changes. It's important. It's worth the effort. It's worth the money. There are a ton of ways that you can figure out how to eat more affordably, even if it's organic, if you're cooking the food yourself. If you roast a chicken that's organic, then you make the bone broth from the bones. You just sort of learn how to mix and match, and it's definitely doable.
And it becomes kind of an artistic experience, right? I mean, when you take food seriously, it becomes fun. Actually, it's much more than just the drudgery of cooking.
Oh, absolutely. I love it. I've been cooking like crazy all week. I got this new Mexican cookbook and it's trouble for me.
Exactly.
I know it's kept you longer than I should, but I just want to say my most heartfelt thank you to you. Your work has been so inspirational, and truly I probably would not be here trying to advocate for children's health and families' health if it wasn't for a lot of the work that you've done and for the spirit that you've tirelessly fought forward in like really challenging times. And
It really is. Certainly keeps me busy.
oh, I have no doubt. But I'm super grateful for your time and your wisdom. So thank you so much. And I look forward to learning more from you over the years, and hopefully maybe you can come back and we can nerd out some more.
That would be great. I enjoyed talking to you, and thank you for the work you're doing as well. Very, very important.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Radical Remedy Podcast. The Radical Remedy Podcast is for general informational purposes only and does not constitute the practice of medicine, nursing, or other professional healthcare services, including the giving of medical advice, and no doctor/patient relationship is formed. The use of information on this podcast or materials linked from this podcast is at the user's own risk. The content of this podcast is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Users should not disregard or delay in obtaining medical advice for any medical condition they may have and should seek the assistance of their healthcare professionals for any such conditions.